Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ghoul Guides Association. I am Lauren, and
I'm Mary.
we have to do that now like this because we are venturing into the world of podcasting as well as YouTube. So we've been on a bit of a hiatus. Mary became a doctor of literature, as we know, so we are now officially Dr. Lauren and Dr. Mary. I lost all the blood in my body to places nobody quite yet knows, although anemia is perhaps the most appropriate illness that a gothicist can have. But we are back and we are very excited, if not a little bit rusty, and we're going to be making some new content. And this is the first of our new content. How does it feel, Dr. Mary, going?
It feels very exciting. I'm glad to be back. I'm glad to be back with you. And I'm excited to delve into this.
I love you, friend. So great. Will anyone watch? Will anyone listen? Are we just talking to each other? We will find out. But you know, it is exciting because we had this great plan for this new thing called the Ghoul Guides Association, where we were gonna, reformat our content, have a space to invite friends now and then I got really sick and Mary had to finish her PhD and none of it happened. So we're back. If you don't know who we are, or you are brand new, or you forgot who we are because it has been a while, we are Dr. Lauren Nixon and Dr. Mary Going. We are the Ghoul Guides, and we are experts in all things Gothic. And we firmly believe that pretty much everything and anything is Gothic. And that's the purpose of this, the Ghoul Guides Association, to talk about things that you might not realize are Gothic, to invite friends and colleagues to come along and give us some insight into some kind of fun, weird and wonderful aspects of the Gothic, and just to do what we love to do best, which is talk to each other and hopefully you along the way. So this is our first episode, our first official episode. And Mary, I know that you like to live your life by certain mottos, and that one of those is eat the rich.
Yes, eat the rich, which is a one of the best, if not the best, Motorhead songs. Exactly. But also just a good mantra to live your life by.
Yeah, rules to live by. And lately there have been some hot discussions on spaces such as Twitter about the fact that billionaires are ridiculous and unnecessary, considering we're in a global financial crisis. And it really got me thinking about the French Revolution.
Of course. What else would you be thinking about, Lauren?
What else would I think about? I mean, if you know me, you probably do know that I'm often thinking about the French Revolution. But actually, when I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, we always think that the French Revolution perhaps is obviously the beginning of all things Gothic, and everybody knows about the French Revolution. But I kind of thought about it and I was like, actually, maybe that's not the case. So what I want to do today is I want to talk to you about the French Revolution, and not only the background of the revolution, why the revolution happened, but why it's so important in terms of the Gothic, because I think a lot of people maybe don't realize how much of an impact the French Revolution had in Britain. And Britain had a kind of weird response to the French Revolution, and one that gave birth to the Gothic, not just because of the terror and the guillotining, and there was a lot of that, but because it kind of birthed English nationalism. And that's something that we're dealing with quite a lot right now. So I figured, why not take it right back to the beginning and talk about the French Revolution? So I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to tell you all about it.
It sounds excellent, and I'm very, very much looking forward to diving into why the French Revolution is Gothic.
Thank you. Okay, here we go. So admittedly, if you know much at all about the Gothic's history, you're probably thinking the French Revolution, Lauren, really? Is that not completely obvious? Does not everybody already know about the Gothic and the French Revolution? But yes, okay, probably. But what I really think is, do we understand how the French Revolution was actually a catalyst for the Gothic? Not just as a medium, but as an ideology and as a cultural kind of touchstone. So yes, okay, the answer is probably yes. It's very obvious. It's very obviously Gothic. You do not have to ask, well, but is it Gothic? It's the French Revolution. But what you might not realize is just how much Britain's response to the French Revolution itself is Gothic, and why events in this period are so intersected with the rise of the Gothic. Okay, so our background. You may or may not be aware that the revolution is generally accepted to have begun on the 5th of May, 1789. But I want to take you back a few decades earlier to a period known as the 7 Years' War, which was
of course, can I just say, of course we're going back to the 7 Years' War, Lauren. But
Mary, what are you trying to say?
Love the content. Let's get stuck in.
Look, okay, I spent a lot of time researching the 7 Years' War, and I just feel an innate need to shoehorn it into everything and make sure everybody knows about it. Because, you know, even though it's clearly a war that went on for 7 years,
no, really?
Maybe people don't know, Mary. I mean, I once did wonder, like, maybe I should work it out, because I feel like it was actually like 6 years and 10 months, but that doesn't sound as cool. But yeah, the 7 Years'
6
War.
and 10 months war.
6 and 10 months war. I mean, it kind of sounds cool if you say it like that, but it would have been a real ball ache to write that in my thesis repeatedly. Mm-hmm. Okay, so why is this important? And I'm not just banging on about it because it's one of my weird periods in history that I specialize in. It's actually kind of the First World War. Not the First World War as in World War I, the thing that took place in 1914, but the first actual war that took place on a global scale. So, you know, just disclaimer, war is bad. I do not think that war is a good thing, but this is really important in terms of history because it's the first time we have conflict on a global scale. And the 7 Years' War was basically conflict between Britain and France, because isn't it always, over who would become the first global superpower, aka fight to the death for the most aggressive colonizer. So it took place between 1756 and 1763, which is 7 years. And it was fought in North America, Canada, the Caribbean, and various Western European countries, including what we would now know as Austria, Hungary, and Germany. So global, we're talking everybody.
Big scale, and basically Britain and France are getting everyone involved, whether they want to or not. Standard.
Yeah, pretty much. You know, this is a period in time when both nations are using people in enforced slavery to fight. They are literally going, this land is, I mean, they're fighting over whose land it is when it's actually neither of their lands in the first place, which, you know, is empire and colonization in a nutshell. But yeah, this is not, you know, this is not a war over an ideal or against fascism. This is a war for money, land, and power. Not that Britain told any of its people that, of course, because that's not what Britain does. Importantly, it's also kind of the first major conflict, or particularly kind of like global conflict that Britain fights as a united nation. I'm doing the air quotes here, after the Act of Union in 1707. So Britain went in on the propaganda. And when I went in, I mean like seriously went in on it. The country spun this whole idea to the people that this was an issue of national security, and that the very integrity of Britain and what it meant to be British, which, bear in mind, nobody knew at this point and it wasn't a thing, but it was at stake, whatever it was. A pamphlet by this guy called H. Worthington in 1758 with the absolutely ridiculous title of A Letter Adapted to the Present Critical Juncture, addressed to all military gentlemen by sea and land, pointing out the true soldier as animated by religion and the love of his country. Yeah, that's the whole title.
I love titles like this where it's just like, here's everything that I'm gonna, you know, like in the 18th century, no one was pulling their punches. You put everything in the title, everything.
Also, a lot of this is capitalized. religion and the love of his country is capitalized, like all in capital letters. It's fantastic pamphlet, but also a great example of the wildly francophobic and completely unfounded rhetoric that was being shared. So this Worthington guy, he writes, and I quote, "Behold them like a swarm of hungry locusts ravaging your delightful country, which before them is like the Garden of Eden, behind is a desolate wilderness. Imagine you see the paleness and horror of every female countenance, that you hear the shrieks and lamentations of a defenseless multitude, that you see all who make no resistance flying with amazement from cities and villages for shelter, leaving their dear habitations, their treasure, their all, to the ravage of foreign plunderers." He also then later said that the Frenchmen, bloodthirsty and inhuman, would see your venerable aged parents butchered, your virgin daughters, capitalized, deflowered, your very wives first prostituted, then cruelly murdered, and it may be your tender infants dashed against the stone. So,
I mean, everything always goes back to Eden. Like,
right?
what a religious cliche. But also, like, oh yeah, like for women, you need to protect your women. Like,
Protect the women.
Women. Oh man, like get another.
The French are coming with their fashion and their accents and their class. So yeah, two things about this. The first one, I introduced to you the origins of British nationalism, and two, the heavily Gothicized language that's being used here to depict the French. The French are at this time in this kind of propaganda, and it's not just this, there's lots of examples, it's just a particularly good one, good being a loose term, into these like terrible papal backward enemy threatening Britain's progress as an enlightened nation. And basically this is the lie that's used to convince everybody of this conflict. So it's like, oh no guys, it's not about money and power and the rich becoming rich. It's about protecting you, the British people, from the foreign invaders who are going to come here and take your land and your wealth and your women. And why does that sound so familiar in 2022?
Yep. Yeah, it's the creation of the nation state as a kind of body politic specifically, where you have, and specifically kind of like with the female kind of personification and the woman that needs to be protected, the idea that the nation, like a body, is closed and you have to protect it from any kind of threat, and specifically foreign and religious threats.
The dirty foreign invaders with their strange backwards religions going to corrupt enlightened Britain. Nothing has changed in over 200 years, and I say it in that voice so it doesn't make me sad.
yeah.
Okay, so ultimately Britain wins and France loses. Britain gains a huge number of territories around the globe because colonialism, when two white nations fight over land that doesn't belong to either of them. And Britain becomes essentially this big global empire. It's already on its way, but this kind of, secures it. And Britain and France, not France. Now, admittedly, they've always had bad blood. Historically,
the beef between like England and France goes way back.
Way back. And I keep saying Britain here, but like just because it's historically accurate, but there's a big argument that this isn't Britain, it's just England, and then the subjugated people of Wales, Scotland and Ireland. Like this is not a nation.
England is always the one that's like starting off all this drama and like these spats with other nations, and then eventually wars. And
I think that this is why England made such a big deal about Napoleon being short, because England has big short person energy. They're short and they're really angry about being short, and I say this as a short person who unfortunately is also English.
I can second that.
So yeah, the bad blood is bad. It's real bad. It's also extremely expensive. Both countries almost bankrupt themselves. England, funnily enough, is unable to manage the fact that it now has a global empire, because guess what, guys? Trying to be the new Rome, like Rome fell for a reason, because it was too big and couldn't be commanded and too many people were involved. But hey, you know what happens next? A journey into glorious anarchy for the French, or at least what begins as glorious anarchy. So a bunch of stuff happens next that is for another podcast, not important right now. It's important, not important right now. But the thing to note is, in 1775, the American colonies said, you know what? No, thank you. Take your tea, leave. We will have no more of this, and rebel against British rule.
And literally do the most insulting thing that anyone can do to English or British person, and just throws all the tea leaves in the harbour.
Throw all the tea leaves in the harbour. And if you want to know about why tea is Gothic, you can go watch our tea is Gothic video on our YouTube, because I do still find it hilarious that the way that the Americans push back against British rule is by dumping the tea they had stolen from India into the sea. But again, story for another podcast. What's important though here is that France is still super pissed at Britain. So when the American revolutionaries reach out for allies, France are very, very quick to answer. And
I mean,
as you probably
story
know,
of British history, Britain does something like controversial, or like, you know, just Britain is the dick, and then everyone else is like, oh yeah, we'll join you because we hate them as well.
Yeah. It's like the story of the country is like Britain stupid, Europe mad about it. Yeah, basically. So yeah, they back the revolutionaries, and I think we probably all know who won that war, because we have all seen The Patriot, fantastic film starring Heath Ledger. So as you're probably figuring out, 7 Years' War is key context, not only to why the French Revolution happened, but why it is a catalyst for the Gothic. In Britain, France, and the Gothic, Angela Wright, shout out to our PhD supervisor, establishes how crucial elements of the Gothic traditions can be traced to this Anglo-French tension way before the outbreak of the 7 Years' War. Of the French Revolution to the 7 Years' War. Getting my historical events mixed up, and we're not even 10 minutes into the episode. And basically acknowledges that there's this desire to create this British form of literature that is separate from French influence. So Britain essentially appropriates the Gothic from France, pretends it was never French to begin with, ignores the fact that, you know, chivalry comes from the Chevalier, and gives birth to the tradition of the Gothic novel. So the Gothic is kind of born out of sticking two fingers up to France, and not wanting to be influenced by the French. So that's how we get there. Does that all make sense so far?
I mean, I'm definitely following you. And yeah, fascinating stuff.
Cool. Okay, so what actually happened? So France gets back from the 7 Years' War, and they've suffered a huge defeat, massive loss of territory, and are missing a whole lot of cash. France is currently being ruled by Louis XV, also known as Louis the Beloved, which is a name that sounds kind of nicer than he deserves, who had succeeded Louis XIV, the infamous Sun King himself, under what we would later come to know as the Ancient Regime. I cannot speak French. My French pronunciation is terrible. I apologize in advance. But basically, the Ancient Regime is a feudal system of hereditary monarchy, in which kings, in this case the House of Bourbon, had absolute power granted by God. And the Ancient Regime is basically the absolute monarchy of all absolute monarchies. Like it's was the supreme.
It's like in Britain, where you have the divine right of kings, where the monarch was literally chosen by God and is therefore ruling not only as the kind of like head of state and the big kind of political and like military power, but also has this kind of like divine kind of sanction behind it.
Yeah, exactly. And if you know much about the French courts, like the French courts were insane. There was poisonings, there was people dancing till their feet were bloody, there was all sorts of intrigue, it was fashionable, it was excessive, like it was a lot, just a lot. And essentially in this system there's three groups. The first estate, which is the clergy, the second estate, which is the nobility, and the third estate, which is everybody else. So that includes commoners, be they peasants, laborers, shop workers.
Shout out for the commoners.
Whoop whoop, the proletariat, and the growing bourgeoisie, so the middle classes. So this is quite a new class, but they are the businessmen, the merchants, court officials, lawyers, etc., etc., etc. So first estate, second estate, third estate, all of whom are underneath the great divine king himself. So the reasons the French Revolution happened are incredibly complex, and we do not have multiple history books. This is a podcast / YouTube show. So I'm going to break it down into 3 key points for you. Number 1, Louis XV loved love. By which I mean that
that's so
he loved
romantic.
love, right? And of course, by that, I mean he had a ton of very public and very messy affairs.
Did he love love, or did he love sex?
I mean, he was called Louis the Beloved, and I feel like he was just like a big royal fuckboy. I think he imagined himself to be very romantic in like both capital and small r, but actually he just fucked around a lot. And he had very public mistresses, and those mistresses had a lot of power at court, and also those mistresses were often trying to off each other and like, you know, screwing with the queen, and then people were like, well, maybe my daughter can be the mistress, and there was a lot of chaos. And of course, whilst chasing all of these tails, he had basically no interest in ruling, which had people moving real mad. This guy was not interested in ruling. He could not give a crap. He was the king, and you know, his grandfather had been an incredibly powerful, pretty tyrannical, but also very charismatic leader, and it essentially like left him this court that was just full of sycophants. No one is telling a Louis no at this point in time. So he's succeeded by his 19-year-old grandson, Louis XVI, in 1774. And people at this point are fed up. The monarchy is excessive, it's despotic, and poor little Louis, we'll call him little Louis because there's 3 at this point, poor little Louis is not equipped to deal. Now, I don't want to defend Louis XVI by any means, but he was doomed from the start. You know, he was never meant to be Dauphin. His father was supposed to, you know, take the throne. So he was meant to be maybe king eventually, but he dies quite early. So I think at like 15, he becomes the Dauphin. He's married to some random European girl who was like 14. Poor Marie Antoinette, they make a change of name and everything. And age of 19, they're plopped on the throne all of a sudden, and everybody sees him as an in. So there's a lot of people with a lot of opinions on what should be happening in France.
He's basically like a boy king that hasn't really had a chance to grow into like just an adult, and you know, has all this power thrust upon him, and then is, you know, suddenly in charge of a country.
Exactly. Have you seen 19-year-olds?
You're just a little boy.
He's just a baby.
Yeah.
Like he's a baby. I mean, when I was 19, I don't want to talk about when I was 19. It's a time that I like to, a halcyon day that I like to pretend didn't happen. I could barely take care of myself, never mind rule an entire country and all of its many colonies. Because this is a big ass country at this point in time, which leads us to point 2, debt. So much debt. So you're probably aware of the infamous misquotation from Louis XVI's queen, Marie Antoinette, about letting the people eat cake if there was no bread. Yeah, I'm not going to get into what happened there. If only because I don't want to be an Edmund Burke sympathizer, which I'll come to later. But basically, Louis, and to her credit, to an extent, Marie Antoinette, attempt to solve the debt crisis. But his parliament are having absolutely none of it. Bear in mind, you know, 1774, he's 19. So even as we get into the 1780s, he's only in his early 20s. And as anyone who probably went to university knows, it's really, I could not manage my finances alone at 19, never mind an entire nation's. But he does try, he tries to solve the debt. And the Second Estate are like, no, that's going to cost us a lot of money. Let's not do that. So the nobility are unwilling to shoulder the national debt, despite the fact it's basically their fault. So Parliament's having none of it. They throw out the plans to save it, and the aristocracy is living in luxury. See, for example, Marie Antoinette's idyllic farmhouse or the French court styles. I mean, they're amazing. They look super cool, but you're wearing silk embroidery while people are starving.
This is really reminding me, just to kind of sit forward into like our contemporary 21st century for a minute, about just the entire resistance to a wealth tax or other kinds of like windfall taxes or anything.
Yes.
And specifically like the pushback by billionaires who are like, no, we don't want you to shrink our wealth by any amount. We have all of this money, but you can't have any of it. And again, it falls to the poor people who are like, well, we're struggling to eat, we're struggling to like keep the heating on. There's literally a slogan in our country at the moment, being like, where people are forced to choose between heating and eating. And it's like, it's exactly that, where the people who have political capital and have the ear of politicians, or even, to name drop, well, I won't mention any names, but one specific politician who just recently got onto the rich list, are kind of stopping things like wealth taxes, even though it's not like someone saying, we're going to take all of your money. We just want to take some of your money because you have a lot and you really don't need it.
Exactly. This is like when people are crowdfunding for basic necessities, and Kim Kardashian is like, get up off your ass and work. Why don't you just work, poor people? Why don't you just work?
Just to correct the record, because this is it's a pervasive misconception. Most people in poverty, especially in the UK, are already in work. Work is not going to solve the issue here. What we need are, radical structural changes, possibly like wealth taxes. But anyway, to return to your point, the aristocracy, time and time again, block those efforts.
What's debt if you can fob it off onto the poor people and carry on living in luxury? What's a little debt? But of course, our third reason, our old friend, the Age of Enlightenment. So the year after Louis XVI was crowned, America has its revolution, and the French are like, interesting. So one of England's, and this is where it gets kind of funny, one of England's big anti-French messages all the way through the 7 Years' War was they do not have a constitutional monarchy. Britain loves to bang on about the glorious revolution of 1688 in the British Constitution and the fact that we have democratic freedom under a constitutional monarch. And Britain have been throwing this in France's face, like, look at you guys with your like despot monarch. It would never be us, apart from it was. But anyway, there's a whole thing. This is a whole thing. The Age of Enlightenment's happening. The revolution's happened. France have assisted in the revolution. And for some reason, the French nobility thought that people would just see this as like a big fuck you to England and not make them think, maybe I should also do a revolution. Shall we do a revolution?
Shall we do a revolution?
Shall we do a revolution? Of course, we have the Marquis de Lafayette, who, yes, is nobility. Bit of a problematic dude. We won't go into that right now, but he is a key player in the American Revolution, as you'll know if you have seen Hamilton. And he's also a major political figure in France. No surprise, he goes home to France and is like, hey guys, revolution. So these are our big three. We've got a really excessive, screwed up royal family, because aren't they all? We got a whole lot of debt, and we have the Age of Enlightenment. So After a failed harvest and another failed attempt to solve the debt crisis, Louis XVI dismisses his financial minister, a man who was very sympathetic to the Third Estate. So this was a bad move. And he decides that it's time to reform the royal army in Paris. Because in his head, in his poor little baby head, he's like, people don't take me very seriously, but I'm the king. And what does the king have? Soldiers. Always great when you use the military to cement your power and to suppress people. And no surprise that what happens next, because history always shows that when you make a big political decision and then suddenly show up military presence, it always goes really, really well. The people of Paris start to get sus. They're like, why you need all them soldiers, Louis? What are all those soldiers for? Like, what's the purpose of them? And not only are they French soldiers, he's also hiring mercenaries from neighboring nations.
And it's not very subtle. Like, it's not very subtle. It's not easy to hide like thousands upon thousands of soldiers and mercenary, and also all of the kind of like equipment, like
exactly. Like a lot of these dudes have, just be like, a lot of horses in the street at the minute. lots of guys with bayonets. There must be a convention. Like pretty sus. So before long, the kind of discourse in the street becomes crowds of protests, and things start to get violent really, really fast. The chaos erupts, people are protesting, people are looting, and I just need to say, like, people are looting. There is literally no food. There is no food in Paris apart from for the rich people. So really, can you blame them? As someone who gets incredibly hangry, I would probably loot someone if I was denied breakfast. Definitely would loot the rich if they were starving me and refusing to solve national debt crisis. We'll see how that goes in the next few weeks, shall we? So the Third Estate begin to mobilize. The people start to mobilize. And on the 14th of July, 1789, the Bourgeois Militia of Paris, which now sounds like a brigade of like Karens, like the Bourgeois Militia of Paris, like now that
sounds really bougie.
Yeah, doesn't it? Like they're going to come in and be like, we demand to speak to the manager.
Can you imagine?
I mean, that is terror. That is legitimate terror. But no, this is like a common people's militia. And they storm the Bastille. And the Bastille is this iconic fortress prison that had become the symbol of royal tyranny to many people. Funnily, there's actually like nobody in it. There were 7 prisoners in the Bastille at the time of the storming, which nobody actually knew. Like the public didn't know this.
You're telling me that all of these Gothic retellings of the French Revolution and the Bastille of like hundreds upon hundreds, maybe thousands of people trapped in there, suddenly getting freed, are all wrong?
Yeah, soz.
Wow.
I mean, part of it is that they move people. They kind of get the impression that this might happen, so they start moving like famous prisoners. I think they moved the Marquis de Lafayette, don't quote me on that. But also because it was basically pointless. Like they didn't need it, but it was taking all of this money. They have loads, they're using it as an excuse to station soldiers essentially. So it is this massive financial drain. So
that's really interesting of itself, the fact that, even just in this one little thing, like this myth has been created specifically by, British Gothic literature that then has become a kind of like urban legend. As in that, well, not an urban legend, but just a kind of, I guess,
it's myth, like a cultural legend,
myth,
isn't it? Like a cultural myth.
Yeah. But it's so pervasive. It's so pervasive.
Yeah. There was basically no one there. But though, you know what there was? A shit ton of cannons. There was a lot of cannons. And like all sorts of artillery and weaponry, and
that's exactly what the commoners need when there's no food to go around. Lots of like military equipment and cannons.
Yeah, cannons. I personally think that we do not have enough cannons. I do love a cannon. I have to say, I love a cannon. Big fan of a cannon when you go to see a castle. just me. Maybe that's maybe that's what I'll run on when I run for government. More cannons.
You heard it here first, people.
You heard it here first. My political statement is more cannons. So yeah, so the Bastille itself like has become a bit of this cultural mythology, but it still did stand for something, and actually the reason for storming it still very much stood up. What's really interesting is the way that what goes down gets recorded in history. And this is where we go back to Gothic purposes, because the way it's reported back in Britain is quite interesting. So there's this guy called Edward Rigby. He's a British doctor, and he famously reported of the storming of the Bastille that we perceived two bloody heads raised on pikes, which were said to be the heads of the Marquis de Lafayette, governor of the Bastille, and of the Monsieur Flesselles, Prévôt de Marchands. I think that's how you say it. I think Prévôt is like provost, I'm not sure. It was a chilling and horrid sight. So yeah, the Bastille literally being torn down like stone by stone. People are tearing this thing apart. By the time it was finished, there was basically a gap in the skyline, which is, you know, quite reminiscent to take us back to 1764 of the end of the Castle of Otranto, because spoiler alert, the castle falls down at the end, as this kind of symbol of the end of the Gothic tyranny. So the Bastille gets torn down and the French Revolution officially begins. So we've started, it's going, it's happening, it's real. So what happens next is a series of varying attempts at a constitutional monarchy. So at the beginning of the French Revolution, and there's lots of different ideologies going on at this time, but at the beginning, the general consensus is not to overthrow the monarchy, but to institute a constitutional monarchy. So a monarchy that is, I guess restricted is the best way to put it, by a democratic parliament. So the people have a say.
I guess it's trying to, you know, skip over the turmoil that we had when we, you know, decapitated our monarch, and then had another kind of leader, Oliver Cromwell, and then after that it was kind of like, well, what do we do now? And that's how we ended up with a constitutional monarch. But there was, I mean, skipping over a lot of stuff and a lot of like, you know, turmoil, violence, you know, power vacuums, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no one wants a power vacuum. This is why if you are hypothetically, if you are gonna overthrow a political system, make sure you have a good plan for what happens next, because power vacuums be bad. And this, Napoleon can tell you this,
and so can Oliver Cromwell, or at least his son, because there was no there was no roadmap for what would happen after that, you know. And we didn't get kind of de facto prime ministers until the 18th century, the middle of the 18th century, with Robert Walpole. But the idea of like, well, who is going to be in charge? And a lot of people thought that it was going to be Oliver Cromwell's son, because of course, you know, you have hereditary monarchs, so that's just how that kind of lineage goes.
How it works, right?
But Oliver Cromwell's son was not very good.
He was not good.
Yeah.
Like, he wasn't a bad guy, he was just kind of crap. He was just a bit crap. He wasn't.
I get, you know, thinking in terms of revolutions, you maybe don't want to rock the boat too much, so going from a different kind of monarch to a constitutional monarch that limits their power.
And also it's worth remembering, people at this point in time still think that maybe God has put the king on the throne. So you do have a bit of an issue here that, like, if you kill the king or if you depose the king, are you peeing God off? There's a question there. So
it's the overlap of regicide and deicide, where because of the divine right of kings, the fact that not only is the king God appointed, but also God's representative, and to kill the king is to then also symbolically, or perhaps in some way literally, kill God or kill a part of God. So it is, you know, in terms of like being a revolutionary act, it borders on or smashing into being, you know, sacrilegious.
There's a big overlap in that pie chart. So at first everybody's like, okay, constitutional monarchy, let's make a new French constitution. So they try to do this. Lots of different versions of government get put in place. There's different groups, the famous of which are the Jacobins. They try to establish a national assembly. They even make a new calendar, revolutionary calendar, which is a fun idea. I personally hate it. It makes it really difficult when you're studying because you're like, which month is that? I don't know. But yeah, they're like, no Gregorian calendar for us. And, you know, I respect it. I respect trying to make your identity. For me personally, pain in the ass. But the months sounded nice. They had cool names. So there's a revolutionary calendar. But it doesn't really work because there's too many warring factions, too many conflicting ideals. You still, of course, have those who are, you know, noble but sympathetic to the third estate. The third estate itself is such a huge, like, divisive, diverse group of people. So, you know, you've got everyone from peasants to lawyers. Like, there's a big gap between those people. And it doesn't really work. There's not really coherent. And also, guess what? Before long, everybody starts betraying each other. So you've got murders in bathtubs, you've got poisonings, you've got spies, all sorts of stuff is going on. And in 1791, Louis and his family are like, things are not going in our favor, and they try and run away. People did not like this. They were like, ho, 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 you are a traitor to the revolution. And in 1793, they killed him, famously chopped off his head, which, you know, we did it first. We've been executing monarchs with the guillotine for years in this country. I mean, fair enough, we didn't guillotine Anne Boleyn. Like, we just chopped her head off with an axe. But I think they guillotined Charles, didn't they? Or did they just chop his head off? We love an axe in England. We love an axe.
Yeah. But, you know, beheading's a great way, you know, to I mean, I say this, we're not advocating for murder. Please do not go out and
disclaimer.
Murder anyone.
The Ghoul Guides do not advocate murder.
But if one were to, you know, in the past, not in the present, get rid of a kind of pesky monarch, you know,
beheading.
Yeah.
Which, you know, was seen as a noble way of dying, unlike hanging. But yeah, in 1793, Louis XVI, dead, beheaded. I'm skipping over a lot here, to be fair, but the arrest and the execution of the king and the royal family is essentially what leads to Britain ending up in the Revolutionary Wars, because Britain hears about the execution and the regicide, and they're shocked and appalled, and they,
why on earth, how could a nation behead their monarch? What
I know, right?
What cretins, who could do this?
Who would do such a thing? So yeah, they expel him. They're like, oh, we no longer recognize you because you just killed your king, because of course, you know, he did it, not everybody else. And they kick him out of the country. So the French ambassador is kicked out of the country, and the revolutionaries are like, well, expelling the foreign diplomat is essentially a declaration of war, so we're going to war. I mean, Marie Antoinette's brothers were already hella pissed at this point, and they ruled significant portions of Europe between them. One of them's the Holy Roman Emperor. What a title. I mean, it should not exist, but I just think it's a cool title. So they're already at war, and then Britain joins in, and thus begins the French Revolutionary Wars. So there we go. That's how, in a nutshell, the French Revolution happens, and that's how Britain gets involved. Bada bing, bada boom, dead king.
And of course, you know, Britain absolutely being 100% hypocritical, but the image of you know, the king being beheaded, being guillotined, it, you know, was everywhere in Britain. And how more Gothic can you get than, you know, the sins of the past being, you know, coming to fruition upon this monarch, and the end, you know, complete like revolutionary turning over, like you say, like, you know, there's parallels with the fall of the Bastille and what happened in Otranto with the crumbling of the castle, and this is just a different kind of crumbling. It's the crumbling of the monarchy. It's a big thing, and there were pictures and there were stories everywhere, and also, you know, Gothic texts and Gothic novels, like it was everywhere.
It was everywhere. You could not escape it. And as Mike Kilgore has noted in The Rise of the Gothic novel, the Gothic was, and I'm quoting here from Kilgore, part of the reaction against the political, social, scientific, industrial, epistemological revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries, which enabled the rise of the middle class. Of course, we're going back to the bourgeoisie and the revolution. So it's long been accepted by scholars of the Gothic that the Gothic is a literature of terror, that erupted. It existed beforehand, but it erupts after the French Revolution. I mean, it does make sense. The French Revolution dominated European politics for about the next 30 years. Like, people would be born, would debut, would get married and have children, like, all before all of this ended. They would have never known anything different. So this is like a huge social shift. And the revolutionaries' rallying cry of liberté, equalité, fraternité would have monarchies all over Europe absolutely shitting their pants. People thought that this was the end of the world. They thought it was the beginning of the world. All of a sudden, Europe's great monarchies don't seem so deified anymore. They don't seem so strong anymore. And it gives birth to all of these philosophies and ideologies on human rights and government and education and arts, like even fashion. Fashion pre the French Revolution is like very sort of like, it's that Rococo Gothic. It is the kind of intricate embroidery, massive wigs, huge powdered, makeup, and it's just excessive. And then the French Revolution happens, and all of a sudden, which, let's be honest, the style and fashion the French Revolution makes sexy has now been sexy for like nearly 300 years. Like, all of a sudden, this simplistic, this well-cut, this kind of like noble heroic fashion with strong colors becomes really popular. So it impacts everything. And at one point, everybody's like, this is amazing, including Britain. People in Britain, some people at the beginning are like, this is great. But unfortunately, the revolution also brings chaos and the so-called reign of terror. Trying to establish a strong revolutionary government after the abolition of the monarchy, but with no clear plan in place when the monarchy was abolished, meant that enemies of freedom, as they were called, were arrested, publicly executed, most of them by guillotine, but often like shamed and sometimes fabricated. So thousands of people were killed this way, and a lot of them were under false charges. Marie Antoinette, like all her flaws, was accused of everything from like incest to witchcraft to justify her execution.
It's such a lazy accusation. Like,
oh my god,
here's this troublesome woman, let's just call her a witch and kill her. Like,
seriously. They said she was a witch. They said that she was a heretic, but they also said that she had sexual relations with her son. Like, they absolutely slandered her. And Marie Antoinette is one of those figures who, I mean, we could do a whole episode just about Marie Antoinette because she's such an influential figure, and there's definitely a strong argument to see her as a very sympathetic character. But she is often represented as a character and like not as a real person. She's kind of like the 18th century Marilyn Monroe. We kind of forget that there's an actual woman at the heart of this. And whatever else, she's someone who's like constantly shoehorned into roles. And it is really sad that even at the end, she's used as this pariah to justify the death of the monarchy, not because of the people, not because of the injustice and the despotism. They say that she's incestuous and a heretic, and yeah, it's all super icky and gross basically. And unfortunately this happens to quite a lot of people, because I do believe in eat the rich. I don't believe in murder. Those two things can exist together.
It's metaphorical in the sense of like, I don't believe that billionaires should exist, not because I don't believe the people themselves shouldn't exist, but because I don't believe anybody should have, or I don't believe anybody needs that much wealth.
I don't want to eat.
Saying let's eat the rich and let's let's get rid of billionaires. It's not a threat on anyone's person. It's saying, let's take your wealth and redistribute it.
I don't want to eat Elon Musk, not just because he probably tastes horrendous, but I want to redistribute his wealth and potentially put him in jail for the various crimes that we're fairly sure he's committed. Please don't sue me, Tesla.
Tesla, a company which he absolutely did not found.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's funny because it's not funny and it's true. Anyway, back to the 1790s before we commit a crime ourselves. So allegedly,
everything we're saying, allegedly.
Okay, so as I said a few minutes ago, like, Britain has a pretty varied response to this. So when it all first kicks off after the storming Bastille, a lot of people are pretty pumped for the French. They're pretty chuffed. As I said earlier, there's been this whole thing about France doesn't have a constitutional monarchy. So at the beginning, they're a bit like, oh, well done, you finally caught up to us. There's a lot of superiority complex going on here, in case you had not guessed. But also we have people like Mary Wollstonecraft, who see the revolution in this very positive light, see it as be it in like Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. There's this whole like set of scholars and thinkers that are like, yes, this is gonna be this wonderful revolution of ideas. And on the one hand, the revolution is there's the new calendar, there's the new constitution, there's all of this beautiful art. They start reclaiming certain religious structures and royal structures and kind of not necessarily erasing them. Like, they don't get rid of religion, though some people did want to get rid of religion, and that's one of the many kind of issues. There was also some weird culty stuff going on within the revolution. But again, podcast for another time. But there's a lot of good going on, and a lot of British people either don't feel threatened by it because they just see it as the French catching up with 1688, or they hope that it's going to inspire something here in Britain. Some people, such as noted hysteric and fuckboy Edmund Burke, are like sobbing to anyone that will listen that the revolution signaled the end of the age of chivalry, and that it was starting to drag Europe into a state of chaos. And as much as I absolutely hate to agree with anything that Edmund Burke has ever said, he unfortunately was kind of right, because the revolution's noble goals were quickly lost in a slew of power grabs, corruption, and political turmoil that ultimately allow a certain somebody by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte, who is not even French.
Wait, what?
Napoleon is from Corsica, like, he's Italian.
What?
Yeah, so this is the thing, like,
how do I know that his penis is now in an American museum and not that he wasn't actually French? I feel like
yes,
maybe like one of those is more important than the other, although the penis fact,
I mean, penis fact is pretty good. Yeah, this is why he was like banished to cause, like, that's where the family from. I believe they grew up in France. Like, Napoleon he becomes Napoleon is not really my strong suit, but
it's like Ted Cruz, who was actually born in Canada.
Yeah, like they're a family of immigrants. Like, they immigrated to France. Someone is going to come for me and be like, actually, but like, that's why originally they spell his name Bonaparte, like the Italian way, and that's why his brother later becomes like, his brother and his sister later on rule like Italy and Spain for him. There was a whole thing going on there. But yeah, so all of this turmoil keeps happening. Everybody's falling out with each other. Like, they have like so many assemblies, so many constitutions. There's a whole ass war going on. And essentially 1799, Napoleon, his brother, and a group of people loyal to them do a coup. They do a coup. By this point, a lot of the leaders of the revolution are already dead. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of them get murdered. There's a lot of spying and intrigue going on. And people in 1799 were starting to panic. Some of the alliances were falling apart. Napoleon basically he's been their greatest war hero up until this point. A lot of people respect him. He does what all great dictators do, and he steps in and he's like, don't worry, I'll fix this problem. And in 1804, he announces himself to be the emperor, fully betraying the revolution.
I mean, that's how I fix all my problems. I just declare myself emperor.
Yeah.
Problem solved.
I mean, you know, life would be so much easier if I could just declare myself emperor when I wanted to.
Yeah.
And that's what he does. So the revolution is like fully betrayed, and Britain, already at war with the revolutionary France at this point, watches on with a mixture of fascination and horror. But when Napoleon comes in, this is when that kind of very, you know, we have a lot of Gothic in the 1790s, and then when Napoleon comes in, it kind of sparks this huge national kind of shock, because even those that are on the side of the revolution and those that aren't, both essentially have the same response, that this is terrible, because the 1799 is generally seen as the end of the revolution, and people, you know, particularly like the young romantics, saw this as the death of the Enlightenment, the death of all of this. And that's why a lot of the romantics are very kind of like anti-Enlightenment, because it's kind of like what happens after the Second World War. They look at the world and they're like, well, look at what happened. You overthrew this king, you killed all these people, and then we're like almost back where we started. Which, if you're a fan of Les Mis, is why there were so many revolutions after the revolution, because Napoleon decides to be emperor. He established family members. He then tries to establish his own kids. Then we have the weird Bourbon revival, where they try and like reclaim the royal family, and it's all very messy for about 50 years at the beginning of the 19th century. But to return to the Gothic, the way that this is all reported in Britain is just fully like a Gothic novel. It's tales of violence and greed and human vice, even in really domestic settings. So Jane Austen had a cousin called Eliza de Fleuil. I think that's how you say it. So she like went over to France pre-revolution to like find a husband. She marries a comte. Everything's great. They come over as one of the many emigres when the revolution kicks off. When things start to go down, he tries to go back and claim his territory, and they guillotine him. Just because, I mean, you know, fair enough. He was like a landowner and stuff, but he was just a pretty chill dude. He goes back over, they kill him. His wife and his young son end up, you know, basically penniless, living with their English cousins. So this is like how big of a thing this is. It's like really touching even the most quiet domestic spaces of Britain. And that Francophobia that the 7 Years' War established just feeds on this Gothic language and these Gothic aesthetics to frame Britain as this chivalric, noble nation that was going to rise up and protect democratic values and the noble freedom of British people and maybe the rest of Europe against this immoral, degenerate invader. And they just kind of transfer that sentiment onto revolutionary France and then transfer that onto Napoleon. And Napoleon, unfortunately, makes it really easy for them to do that. So there's kind of like two halves to this Gothic language. One half is horrified, and it's looking at this violence, and it's thinking, why is this happening? Why is this happening? And you get this in Radcliffe. She's not necessarily like pro or anti, but particularly in like The Mysteries of Udolpho, which is set after the war broke out, she's just horrified at the killing, horrified at war, and she's kind of like, why? But then the other side of it is this violently nationalistic, you know, us against them, Gothic rhetoric that we see even now, fueling so much kind of xenophobic, racist, well, homophobic, misogynistic, transphobic, you know, you name it, you start to see it happening here. It's no surprise that around about this time we get a lot of stories about the Crusades that are very much about a terrifying Turkish Islamic invader that is threatening the sanctity of Christian Britain, which is still being incredibly racist against you know, Turkey or against Arabic people, but is also using it as like a stand-in for France. So
it's also just to cut in here, like the way that this kind of nationalistic rhetoric kind of intersects with the kind of Christian rhetoric to create, you know, this kind of Christian nationalism. Sorry, are you getting to this, or like, because if not,
well,
like,
no, like a little bit, but like go for it, babe. Go for
because
it.
like obviously like the Gothic is like a genre of excess, and like the French Revolution, you know, what's more excessive than like, you know, beheading your monarch and throwing a revolution. And these kinds of like in Britain, like religious narratives kind of jumped on this but took it to kind of like apocalyptic levels. And obviously like at the end of every century you get like an uptick in kind of millenarianism and kind of end times narratives.
Like fin de siècle drives people literally insane.
But also think about like the millennium bug and everything that happened in the lead up to 2000, and the 1790s was no different. And what you had is like all of these kinds of religious pamphlets who were reading all of this stuff about, you know, this violent revolution, and look what they're doing to women, and look what they've done to their king, and mixed up with the kind of Francophobia and anti-Catholicism, and they wove that into their kind of interpretations and their eschatology. So that's the kind of interpretation of the end of times. And, you know, in some interpretations France was literally the Antichrist, or Napoleon was the Antichrist, or the king, or in some ways it was the whore of Babylon. And in every time the revolution was such a violent, chaotic act that it was seen as the kind of, you know, this is the start of the end. And people read it that way and saw it as a kind of omen, and they were literally expecting that what, you know, what they believe is prophesied in the book of Revelation was going to happen, and that specifically all of these prophecies were talking about this. And it's so fascinating, but it's also so Gothic, because, you know, you have these kinds of these things people that are just so extra.
People thought that like that, you know, the lake of fire and the dragon were going to burst from the ground because the revolution was happening. Like people literally thought that this was it. This was 100%. The end of days.
Absolutely.
And what's really interesting is alongside, so like one of the reasons the French Revolution is incredibly violent is because cults. Basically, because of this like end times narrative that's happening, a bunch of cults happen. You have what would become the Panacea Society, and you have I can't remember the names, but the two brothers who renamed themselves and was like, Jerusalem is in Britain. Even when you look at things like William Blake, like people went kind of like completely west after the revolution when it came to spiritualism and religion and cults. And if you are interested in cults, yes, there have always been cults and religious sects, and basically all religion is a cult. Yes, you can quote me on that. But the French Revolution very much sparked modern day cults as we understand them, because people pooped themselves. People were like, this is the end of everything. What's also interesting when we think about the Gothic is that despite the fact that Burke was like, the age of chivalry is dead. I mean, it had died many years before it ever existed, but in the same way that the Enlightenment at the beginning of the 18th century had brought neoclassicism, the revolution basically brought what we could call like neo-chivalry, because all of a sudden Britain is rebranding itself as, you know, somehow the heir to the Arthurian throne. That Britain all of a sudden is this chivalric hero, and you get all of these narratives like looking back to the Crusades and the Knight Errant and Arthur. This is also why you end up later on in the 19th century with like the pre-Raphaelites and stuff, but there's this huge boom in this chivalric imagery and literature. So all of a sudden you have this like return to the age of chivalry that kind of completely ignores everything. I mean, chivalry is unsustainable anyway, but basically ignores everything that chivalry is about and like rebrands it in this very nationalistic light. So essentially, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not just Gothic because, you know, the literature of terror and the terror is happening. It's Gothic because it fundamentally changes the way that people think about essentially everything. the language that's being used to talk about it, the way that it changes the way people look at the medieval period, the way they look at chivalry, the way that people talk about religion and like monstrousness. You have all of these people going off to war, coming back wounded and traumatized, and you have a whole new set of ruins because things get destroyed in the war. And the French Revolution, in the space of 30 years, has so much history. I mean, everything has so much history. Nothing is ever really a quiet time. But in that like 30 years of the revolution, like everything happens so much, so quick. Even between like 1789 and 1793, you have so many different people doing so many different things. It's so chaotic. And it just kind of like vomits up the Gothic. Like it's kind of like, here you go. Like it's terrible, monstrous progeny. And it's like, here it is, here you go. And what's important to remember too is like, on the one hand, the Gothic is used to rebel, to resist, but it's also used like really conservatively. And a lot of people were using the Gothic very much to create nationalism. And, you know, we only need to look at horror to know that some horror resists and subverts, and some horror tries to scare you into never having sex ever and not even looking twice at a cigarette. Like there's two very different strains here. And yeah, like that is really, you know, the French Revolution isn't just Gothic because of what literally happens, but because of the way it's interpreted specifically in Britain, because so much of that early Gothic literature comes from Britain. I mean, another disclaimer just to finish this on, I am not suggesting that Britain is the only country responsible here. I do not like to be particularly British-centric in my ideology, but my research is because Britain likes to fuck around and find out. And it does it a lot.
Britain's just very messy, and
it's such a messy bitch. Britain is such a messy bitch. Such a messy bitch. But what's interesting is like when you think about the French Revolution and you think about sort of like who's the heroes and who's the villains, you think of like Sean Bean and Sharp, you know, like everybody thinks of like Napoleon is clearly the bad guy, you know, you think of things like War and Peace, you think of things like Sharp and Hornblower, and you know, things like Vanity Fair, and it's all very much kind of, you know, history is always told through the eyes of the victor, but you get that so much because it's such a key period. We go back to it again and again and again when it comes to literature, and of course returning and like reconsidering is such a Gothic thing to do. But yeah, that's the French Revolution, Mary, in a nutshell, and that's why it's Gothic.
It's definitely Gothic, hella Gothic.
It's
so
Gothic.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think, you know, like the first thing you learn in your like intro to Gothic or Gothic origins class is how important the French Revolution is when it comes to the Gothic. But I think partway through my PhD didn't still fully understand how important the Gothic was. And I think it's one of those weird things where because we all accept it as a fact, like it's a truth universally acknowledged, to quote my girl Jane, but maybe we don't always fully acknowledge why. You know, I think it's good to go back to it. So I have done, and I hope you found that interesting, everybody. Mary, I hope, you know, you feel enlightened by this knowledge.
I feel enlightened, and I feel like I want to go and read up more about the French Revolution and the Gothic. So yes, job well done, Lauren.
Yeah, and you know, it's still, I would love to say we have come so far, but have we really?
No.
No. The answer is no. Sadly, no. But that's my story for today. That is the French Revolution in a Gothic nutshell, a specifically Gothic nutshell, in a little tiny Gothic walnut shell, just like Queen Mab. And yeah, that's me for today. So I guess we'll be back next time with another Ghoul Guides Association, and it will be Mary's turn to talk about something that we maybe don't always consider as Gothic, or we need to reconsider as Gothic, or maybe shedding light on a bit of misunderstood history. And in the meantime, I am Lauren, and this is
Mary.
Mary. And we are the Ghoul Guides, and do that whole thing, like, subscribe, check out the podcast, check out the YouTube, follow us on Twitter, and stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky, everyone.